Welcome back. Blighted properties and old tires. These issues in the city of New Orleans impact our environment and the air we breathe.
Yeah, WDSU anchor Daryl Forges investigates these problems that are disproportionately affecting people of color in a term called environmental racism. Here's part one of Toxic Risk and Race.
And we got tires galore. When we got boats, we got cars.
Trash, tires, junk. It's all right here in New Orleans East.
This site is the former Hearthwood condominium site, which was a mixed income development prior to Hurricane Katrina.
After Katrina, the complex was demolished and left abandoned for almost 20 years.
People came, tire companies designated this to be the spot where they were gonna offload their tires and debris. And it just kind of caused a spiraling downward effect in the neighborhood.
This right here, it's depressing me. It's a sight that I've never seen.
Sage Michael Pellet has lived in New Orleans East since the 90s. He's also a community organizer and takes pride in making the East a better place.
If we don't stop the trash here, and we're not gonna be able to enjoy our culture. This is actually killing our culture, and we gotta connect the two.
Some environmentalists say the large amount of eyesores like this and other issues in the East are example of what they call environmental racism. So what exactly is environmental racism?
The deliberate targeting of minority communities, particularly communities of color, for exposure to toxic waste hazards, toxic waste facilities, toxic emitting facilities.
The term was coined by environmentalist Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who served in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the 1960s, Dr. Chavis saw an intersection between science and civil rights.
At the precipitating incident that gave rise to my defining the term environmental racism was in 1982. It was a place called Warren County, North Carolina, which was the most predominant black county in North Carolina.
Warren County, North Carolina is where the state decided to have a hazardous landfill storing tons of toxic PCB contaminated soil that came from illegal dumping of toxic wastes along roadways.
The protesters were told not to block the trucks. They're now lying in the streets now, blocking one truck, moving into the landfill.
In response, the NAACP, including Dr. Chavis, staged a massive protest.
Over 500 people were arrested. We literally laid ourselves in front of some of the trucks to stop the dumping of these tons.
While the protest was unsuccessful, it did succeed in sparking a national uprising in the environmental justice movement.
All over the country, we got hundreds of calls saying, well, they're doing the same thing in my community. That gave rise to the definition of environmental racism.
Coalitions were created to speak out for environmental justice and to challenge others to also speak out. In 1986, Dr. Chavis later conducted a study called Toxic Waste and Race. In it, Chavis looks at every zip code nationwide. The numbers back up his thoughts.
You give me your zip code, I can tell you what's in that zip code. And the zip codes where African Americans live, and Latinos, even Native Americans, Asian Americans, disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards.
Fast forward to 4 decades later, Dr. Chavis says environmental racism is still a major issue.
Look what happened in Flint, Michigan. Look at what can happen in Jackson, Mississippi. I would say what is going on in East New Orleans is typical of what is going on across the country, in particular places where they're predominantly communities of color.
And that's what we're doing out here. We're bringing light to the situation.
Right. And a true example of what brings us back to this abandoned property.
I don't understand how this large complex that stemmed from Bundy Road to the Citrus Canal could get away with this much amount without the government really locking it off, abating it.
That was part one of our series. In part two, we focus on the issue of environmental racism happening right in our backyard in New Orleans East and what's being done to affect that area. That's tonight at 10 on WDSU. Earlier at 6, we brought you part one of our series on environmental racism.
Activists and environmentalists, they believe that we're seeing examples of this right in our own backyard. WDSU anchor Daryl Forges gives us an in-depth look at the potentially toxic eyesores and what's being done to make a change in part two of Toxic Risk and Race.
This right here, it's depressing me. It's a sight that I have never seen, so close to a thriving community and so close to our stormwater canal.
A site that also tells a story.
It just tells so many stories of climate disasters and blight and abandonment and a lack of connecting with the community.
And also impacting the environment. Is this an example of environmental racism?
Unfortunately, it's a perfect example of environmental racism.
The divide in terms of how New Orleans East is treated regarding civic services and how other parts of the city is treated. And it's a classic definition of what environmental racism looks like.
Michael McKenzie is an environmental justice leader. He spent countless hours researching and working toward environmental justice across the country. He says the plastics, tires, and tons of debris is impacting the East.
Plastics and tires, they carry these toxic chemicals that can be carcinogenic. And when these toxins sit in the soil for a long time, it essentially contaminate the soil. So even if you wanted to grow something out of that soil, you couldn't.
McKenzie says these toxins could also impact waterways, which could affect animals and our small delicacies, like crawfish. Are the folks in New Orleans East in danger in the future when it comes to their overall health and well-being because of the things that you talked about?
The data says so.
McKenzie's data and research shows that negative environmental factors can lead to chronic health problems like asthma, diabetes, and hypertension for minorities.
It creates so many issues within the environment that, you know, from a health standpoint, it's also critically important that leadership step up.
What I would say here is more like, you know, maybe some form of environmental racism, but environmental and investment neglect.
New Orleans City Councilman Oliver Thomas believes some of the problems in the East is due to the lack of business investment.
If you look at the area, it's ripe for investment out here. Why did the business community redline this area? Why did investors redline this area?
The East is the city's largest African-American voting bloc, and some city leaders are working to give these taxpayers a return on their investment.
Congressman Carter has been a great partner. They're talking about doing a welcome center and making major investments in Bayou Sauvage, especially as it relates to the natural assets in that area. We broke ground on Propel Park.
Also in the East, Bayou Phoenix closed a deal to buy the old Six Flags property in hopes of redeveloping it with sports parks, a recreation area, and other business developments. The old amusement park shuttered since Hurricane Katrina made landfall back in 2005 and has become an eyesore in New Orleans East. The city also approved a $24.6 million plan to fully fund the revitalization of Lincoln Beach.
I want it to be good like it was and better than it's ever been.
And that's a goal environmental activists in New Orleans also hope to achieve. Some are taking matters into their own hands by cleaning up some of these eyesores in hopes of saving and helping their communities. Now, even though some parts of the East are seeing some promise, activists say they will continue to hold those in power accountable.
We got the same laws, but certain people get it applied better for them and not for us. And so what we want to do is make sure that we hold them accountable. If the laws work for them, make it work for us.
For WDSU News, I'm Daryl Forges.
Well, environmentalists in the city say they have been in contact with city leaders about their concerns in New Orleans East, and the hope here is to work together on a plan to get rid of the debris.
Well, they also want to hold those accountable who are dumping illegally. For more information on environmental racism, you can visit our website. That's WDSU.com or our mobile app.
Well, seeing results, that's what some environmentalists say is happening now in New Orleans East. We brought you our series, Toxic, Risk, and Waste on environmental racism. Now the city is acting. WDSU anchor Daryl Forges shows us the progress.
In our two-part series on environmental racism, we showed you this heavily blighted property on Bundy Road in New Orleans East with a lot of tires, a lot of debris, and a lot of trash that's covered this area for well over a decade. Well, fast forward now to today. Look at this property now. It is completely unrecognizable as code enforcement has worked around the clock to try to clear this area as best as they can. Now, speaking to some environmental activists, they have some mixed feelings about this cleanup. kind of tell me your overall emotions and feelings just seeing what you're seeing right now.
Progress. New Orleans East is moving forward.
A difference 48 hours makes. This abandoned property could see some new life after code enforcement spent time clearing the debris and major eyesore in this community.
Overall, it's a great day in the city of New Orleans. We cleared a landfill that was abandoned and neglected for 18 years, and today we have development on the land.
Activists say it's about time.
Community's voice should always be at the forefront of the conversation.
Now, even though progress is being made, local environmentalists say there's still work to be done to make sure the environment here is still safe by continuing testing water, air quality, and plastics on the property.
All of these things are ongoing tests that we've already initiated and that we'll continue to initiate in the coming weeks and months. The beginning of something new, a rebirth, is on the horizon.
And as for these stacks of tires, code enforcement are right now putting them here until they're able to find a permanent place to house them. Now, as for this entire property, Mayor LaToya Cantrell will be out here tomorrow to talk about the progress that code enforcement has made, all in hopes of beautifying New Orleans East. In New Orleans East, Daryl Forges, WDSU News.
WDSU Investigates is getting results. The city announcing progress to demolish eyesores across New Orleans. That announcement comes just days after our team uncovered heavily blighted property in our series Toxic Risk and Waste. WDSU anchor Daryl Forges is following up to see how this demolition is a step toward revitalizing New Orleans East.
We have been doing a pretty aggressive job, I would say, on ridding blight throughout the city of New Orleans.
Blighted property no more. Mayor LaToya Cantrell praising the work of code enforcement and community activists in playing a major role in giving this property, New Orleans East, a makeover and new lease on life.
But it absolutely solidifies that New Orleans East does matter.
Code enforcement spent the past few days cleaning up debris and clearing out trees, all in hope of making this property useful again.
This is part of our major $10 million anti-blight project, which was recently authorized. It was shovel ready, and we started at the beginning of this year.
City leaders say the neighborhood complaints and other issues really drove this home in the push for change.
And that's what we're doing out here.
In our WDSU Investigates two-part series, we showed the issues and concerns by environmentalists who say this big action to clear this 19-acre property is critical.
New Orleans is going into what I call an environmental renaissance period. And it's one where the light is shining. And as we're doing community projects such as this one, it's creating and opening an opportunity for kids to become more aware of environmental stewardship and what it represents and means.
The mayor says this change will help not only reduce crime, but also help relieve the environment from future toxins and illegal tire dumping.
The city of New Orleans is just being very intentional, and we have real examples of that, and we will continue on that path and trajectory.
What efforts like today say is that let's add value to those African-American communities right now. So let's not only stop environmental racism, but let's stop the ability for historical black communities to be gentrified.
For WDSU News, I'm Daryl Forges.
Daryl, thank you. And code enforcement admits there is more work to do, but the office hopes to have the property ready for redevelopment soon. To watch our investigations into environmental racism, just visit our website, WDSU.com.